Hello, my name is James Armstrong and I'm a teacher of politics, and in today's session I'm going to be talking about the 2001 election. Now, this is a strange election to talk about because to some extent 2001 is a foregone conclusion. If we go back to 1997, the defeat the Conservatives suffer is the worst defeat since the Duke of Wellington in 1830. They lose 171 seats in the House of Commons. They fall to 30.7% of the vote, and the swing against them from Conservative to Labour is 10%. So they're at a low point in terms of the number of seats they have in Parliament, in terms of their percentage of the vote, and it's going to require for the Conservatives to win, even with a tiny majority, a similar swing to what Blair achieved. And Blair's success in 1997 was historic. It was an incredible result. So it's very, very, very unlikely, some would say impossible, for any Conservative leader to inherit the Conservative Party and win the 2001 election. And on top of that, William Hague, who takes over in 1997, is still leading a divided party. So there are still divisions over Europe, and also divisions over what the Conservative Party should do in order to try and chart a course back to government. Now, some people argue that Hague needs to get on with modernising straight away. In other words, move the party away from the toxic legacy of Thatcherism, try and detoxify the party, move the party to the centre ground. Others argue that doing that would be dangerous, and that the strategy that Hague should adopt is what you might call a core vote strategy, which is where you stay on the right, in the case of the Conservative Party, and you try and hold on to your core supporters, because what you're worried will happen is if you move to the centre ground, you won't pick up any voters from, or you'll pick up very few voters from Labour because they're occupying that territory, and you'll alienate your core support. So there are divisions about that. There are also divisions, obviously, about Europe, which had plagued the Conservative Party during the time of John Major. Now, Hague eventually decides that he's going to pursue a core vote strategy in this election. So he's seen as moving the party to the right into comfortable territory for the party. Labour, throughout the period in this election, remain ahead by a long way, and so it looks like it's never going to be anything other than a Labour victory. In terms of the campaign, Labour superimpose Mrs Thatcher's hair on William Hague's head. One of the slogans they use is "Get out or they get in." Another one is "Be afraid, be very afraid." And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to say, look, this Conservative Party under William Hague, it hasn't changed, and you need to worry that if the Tories get back in, it'll be back to underfunded National Health Service, large class sizes, all of the things that meant that you voted Labour in the first place. And in terms of how Labour's first term has gone, well, there was a big issue with fuel protests, and that led to a dip in support. But there was a recovery immediately after those protests ended. But actually, fairly uneventful first term. Blair remains popular. The scandals that do happen, so for example, the Bernie Ecclestone affair happens, where the Labour Party they're cutting back on advertising for cigarettes, and they basically exempt Formula One from that. And it transpires that Bernie Ecclestone, who was the big guy in Formula One, had made a massive donation to the Labour Party. So that could have been a huge scandal, but it happens very early in Blair's term. And at the time, Blair is seen as Teflon Tony, and the mud just refuses to stick. And so there's a little bit of a bumpy ride in the first term, but actually the economy's growing. The governments, seem to be in tune with the public, and it's a pretty smooth first term for the Labour Party. And just before we finish talking about the campaign, it's worth mentioning that the standout moment of this election campaign, at least what people will remember when they think back to it, is John Prescott. He gets off the battle bus, which is called the Prescott Express. He walks across the street and an egg is thrown at him from the crowd. And John Prescott's reaction, this is the Deputy Prime Minister, is to punch the protester in the face. In terms of the manifestos, the Tories try and shore up their base, as I said, with a promise of tax cuts, and central to their campaign is the idea that Labour are keen for Britain to join the euro, and so they campaign on this idea of keep the pound. So they're trying to appeal to the Eurosceptic wing of the party in order to shore up the core vote. Now, the media is interesting in this election. We saw that in 1997, the Sun newspaper had switched from the Conservative Party to Labour. Well, in this election, the Times and the Express joined the Sun in backing Labour. So we now have a situation in 2001 where things have completely flipped. For most of the elections that we've looked at from 1979 up until this point, most of the press are backing the Conservative Party. Well, in this election, most of the press are backing Labour, and it's only the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph who support the Conservative Party. Now, the result, because it's a foregone conclusion, it's a very low turnout, and Labour secure another landslide, and the Conservative Party have a bit of a disaster in that they only increase their number of seats by 1, and they only increase their percentage of the vote by 1% too. So this is really, really poor. And in actual fact, because of the low turnout, the number of people who vote Conservative actually goes down between 1997 and 2001. So this is it's an election where, you know, maybe the Conservatives were never going to win, but it's an election where William Hague does very badly. There are lots of explanations for this. I guess the most likely explanation, or the most common explanation, is just to say, well, look, it was always impossible. But we could ask some questions about this election. We could say, well, look, William Hague pursued a core vote strategy. He tried to appeal to the right of the party, to the Eurosceptic wing of the party. Should he have started the process of modernisation? Should he have moved the Conservative Party to the centre ground? Was that even possible? Were the Conservative Party ready to do that? We could ask about the turnout in this election. So was the low turnout hiding a sort of broader disaffection and apathy with both parties? So in the election, the turnout was only 59.4%. That means that over 40% of the population were non-voters in this election. Now, I grew up in this period. There was certainly lots of people who would have said, if you asked them, you know, what's the point in voting? The two parties seem to stand for very similar things. It's not going to make a difference. You've got lots of voters who are voting in safe seats with large Labour majorities. And so those voters might think, well, what's the point of voting? And so, yeah, so I think during this period, there is certainly some of this going on. There are some people who are just put off with politics and decide to not vote. They drop out of the electorate. And that's an important thing, I think, to notice in this election. Finally, does this election demonstrate the influence of the press? The Tories lost the support of most of the press at this election. As I've said, they only retained the support of the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph. And so we could start to build a picture, including this election, and say, well, it seems to be the case that the party that wins is the party that has the support of the press. And we can find that across elections. And actually, if we look forward into the future, it's when the Labour Party lose the support of the press after the financial crisis that the Conservatives are able to form a coalition government in 2010. Okay, so that's it for 2001. Quite a brief summary of this election. It's one that most politics teachers don't teach for the reasons that might seem obvious. It's an election where it's a foregone conclusion, but you can still use it to say some interesting things. And next time, I'll talk about 2005.